And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Sir Patrick Vallance, who is the government's chief scientific advisor, if that needed to be said, I have to say. Because I think it is fair to say that Sir Patrick now needs no introduction whatsoever. We've seen him many, many times at the number 10 briefings, and maybe he will want to comment on some of the discussions that we had earlier during the panel discussion. But I think it's fair to say that when you are being discussed in the pubs and shops of the UK on a daily basis, you have touched a nerve with the public. So you have certainly become a very important part of how we have tackled this pandemic. And so we are very grateful. You must be very busy, but we're very grateful for you finding time this morning to join us. And I very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm sure we all do, and then put some questions to you. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Patrick Vallance.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the Royal Society of Biology as well for this event. Let me start the topics on public trust in science. So I'll start with some numbers, and roughly 60% of people in the UK are more likely to listen to expert advice, or say they are, than before this. In Germany, the trust in science is thought to have gone up fourfold, but worth reflecting that that still means that 37% of the population trust the science wholeheartedly. In France, actually, it's gone down a bit during the process. So at the beginning, the confidence in science was around 84%, and it's now down to 74%. And in the USA, the trust is said to have increased, but the data show only in Democrats. So there is not actually a consistent picture. But overall, you'd say that there is an increase in trust here. But discussion with colleagues around the world show that scientists in every country are under the spotlight, and every country, including Germany, Japan, where I've discussed with colleagues, and indeed in New Zealand, the science comes in for criticism as well as support. So there's a mixture of intense scrutiny, but an overall increase in trust. But I really agree with what David Spiegelhalter said earlier, and Onwurah O'Neill speaks about continuously, which is that this is about trustworthiness, which in turn earns trust, not about seeking to be trusted. There are four themes that I wanted to cover. The first is the science, the second is advice to government, the third is transparency, and the fourth is what I've called players, umpires, commentators and spectators. Just a word about SAGE to start off. SAGE is an advisory body. It's pulled together by COBRA, it's called by COBRA in times of an emergency. It's not a management body. It doesn't have operational accountability. It's not a decision-making body. It provides advice, and it is independent. The members of SAGE who come from academia, industry, other places are not paid. They come and give their time freely, and they are free to make the comments that they make outside the meetings, as many have done. So this is an independent group to give advice into government. Let me take my first theme of the science, and this has already been touched upon. I mean, it is clearly nonsense to assume that you have an immutable body of evidence, which is the science, which can be used repeatedly without changing. This is about the scientific method rather than the science. And the scientific method, of course, is one of inquiry, experimentation, observation, which leads to accumulating knowledge, overturns previous conceptions, challenges orthodoxy, and ends up giving the best available view today, but not one that will stand the test of time in all cases, and therefore you need to be able to change. And that's, of course, particularly true for this situation where we have a brand new virus that we knew nothing about at all at the beginning of January, and information is changing all the time. Take immunity. We knew very little about it at the beginning. We now know that the vast majority of people who are exposed to this virus develop an antibody response. We're increasingly seeing reports that actually those antibody responses in some people may not last more than a few months. We don't know what that means in terms of whether the immunity is strong, how long it might last for, and indeed whether the other parts of the immune response are particularly important to pick up on that. So there's lots of unknowns which we just need to be aware of. Even if you take a relatively obvious thing like transmission, you might think that we know about the transmission of this virus in different environments. We don't. We don't know for sure the proportion of spread by droplets, by surface, by aerosol, and indeed we don't know those things for flu either. So there are many unknowns that will mean that we deal with uncertainty. That two things of scientific method being at the front and uncertainty are key. The expression of uncertainty into policy is a very key part of what SAGE needs to do. And as the science changes, as the evidence changes, as our understanding changes, it's inevitable that therefore advice changes, and whether or not policy changes, of course, is a matter for ministers, but it's important that we will see those changes. And it's very clear that everybody who's been looking at this, all of the people, scientists inside, outside government across the world, have changed views in a number of different areas. I do want to pick up just two things, though. One is the importance of data. And I think one of the areas that is going to be increasingly important going forward is the data that's used, in my view, needs to be open so people can see it. That's going to be incredibly important as we go into looking at different areas of outbreak, incidence and prevalence in different parts of the country. Those data, I believe, need to be there for people to be able to look at. And good data flows in order to be able to do that are critical. The second brief aside here is around international comparisons, and I just want to give something from yesterday, which I was looking at, which if you look at the numbers from France, for example, at the moment, France has twice as many people in hospital as we do with COVID, twice as many in intensive care as we do, and a very much smaller death number than we do. Very difficult to understand what those numbers mean, actually. And it tells us that the comparisons and the ability to look across is going to be pretty complicated as we go into a longer time period and get the opportunity to look at the metrics collected in the same way across different countries. So collecting the data, making the data public and being able to make comparisons is going to be important, but isn't easy. So my second theme is advice to government. And I wanted to just stress that, of course, the primary purpose of SAGE is to give advice to government, and government needs time to make decisions, and it's important to recognize that trust is required there as well. So if you want to be influential in giving science advice, there needs to be trust, and that does bring added complexities. It does mean that as we put our data and our papers in the public domain, it's also right that government has some time to be able to consider them before they're in the spotlight of everybody considering them. So this balance between getting them out there quickly, which we're trying to do, and making sure that ministers have a chance to consider what policies they want to build on the back of that is an important part of this. And it's important also to recognize, and this is where trust in science becomes critical, that the outcomes, i.e. the policy choices and implementation, are not necessarily the same as the advice. The third area I wanted to touch on was transparency, and I've already said that I think there's a real need for some of the data on this, particularly in terms of areas, things like incidence and prevalence, should be much more widely available, and that's a matter of actually getting systems set up to do that. I'll also say that I think we made a misstep earlier on in terms of not making the papers from SAGE available at the beginning of this, and not making the names of people on SAGE available at the beginning of it. That should have happened earlier. There was advice that we couldn't do that. We corrected that. And now the papers are up to date and the names are clearly there. And it's worth saying it's not without its challenges. And there are challenges, for example, for the people on SAGE who, or on the subcommittees, who have received difficult email from people, that is unwanted and intrusive. And so there are difficulties for the individuals. And of course, the other thing that's been very obvious, and Greg Clark alluded to this, is actually once the papers are out there, the noise goes down, not up. And so one of the lessons I think for government, as always, is get the things out there. Actually getting the truth out there is much easier than actually sitting there where people can make up stuff about it rather than actually seeing what's in the paper. So the transparency bit's important, and as has been alluded to, it's not going to be possible for every single SAGE meeting, because in the future there may be ones of national security as well, but there's certainly, in this case, it's very important they are out there. And then my final point is the one I've labelled players, umpire, commentators and spectators, and it's pretty clear that we've got a lot of all of those in this situation, and it's good that we have a lot of those. It's appropriate that we have people inputting advice from different areas, but it does lead to certain complications, and I think the one that is quite important for science to think about is the merging and often difficulty in distinguishing between what is a comment that is a policy comment, a political comment, and a scientific comment. They are often confused and intermingled, and that I think does cause problems. And very often there are very strong and perfectly reasonable comments on policy or politics which get science dragged into them in a way which probably isn't helpful in terms of the science, because there's more consistency, I think, in what the scientists believe amongst themselves than there is upon what you do about it, which is a policy choice. Now, having said that, I have got two areas that I want to just pick up on because I think they've been important during this. The first is, as a general observation, the louder and more strident the voices have been, in general, the weaker the scientific evidence has been. So there's a paradox that very strong opinions are held when scientific evidence is weaker. And I think the job of science is to put the evidence out there with all its difficulties and its weaknesses and uncertainties, and policies can be made on the back of that, provided that uncertainty is properly articulated. We shouldn't pretend that the science advice is stronger than it is, and where it's uncertain, it's perfectly reasonable to make a policy choice on the back of that, which is a strong policy choice, but that does not mean that the scientific evidence is suddenly strong. The second area is that I think there's a risk that we need to be aware of as scientists, which is that with differing opinions, and as I say, sometimes those differing opinions being more about policy than actually science, there is a risk that people will choose to ignore the science because they think everybody disagrees. That's an incredibly important thing to counter, and to be clear again that science is very often not about certainty. It's about understanding the uncertainty and what can be done to reduce it and to explore more. I will illustrate with one particular point, which is quite early on in this epidemic. There was a report that hydroxychloroquine was having some fantastic effect on outcomes from a very small number of patients and a very underpowered study. It's very tempting for some people to jump on that and say, therefore, everybody should be treated with hydroxychloroquine. It's incredibly important that in the UK, a proper study was done. People waited, people were randomized to a study, and the answer came out, which is in the hospital setting, it made no difference. That requires everybody holding their nerve and not jumping onto little bits of scientific information that appear to arise, which are too shrouded with uncertainty to be able to make decisions, particularly when you're talking about key interventions. So I think, to end, the scientific method is what needs to be articulated more in terms of building trust. I think we need to understand the difference between advice to government and how that plays also with engaging the public, which we need to do more of. And I will end with something that was an article in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago from Gideon Meirowitz-Katz, who said hindsight is misleading when it comes to science. And I think we've got to be careful not to apply hindsight to think that actually we know answers that couldn't have been known. And I think as we approach the next phase and all the phases of this illness, we need to approach it with humility, because there are many unknowns still, and therefore we are always dealing with uncertainty, and we need to make sure that we get the right processes in place to generate the evidence. Thank you.
Sir Patrick, thank you very much indeed for those insights. And I was particularly taken with, as our, you mentioned, as our understanding changes, the advice changes, and then we can communicate those changes. At the moment, we've got a public who are listening carefully and are paying attention to what science is saying, particularly around the pandemic. How do we use that new connection that's created between experts and scientists and a public who are willing to listen to those to address some of the other challenges? I did pose this question to Greg, but particularly as we may have to make difficult choices around how we tackle our environment, for example, and decarbonise our economy. Is that something that's being thought about, or is it too early yet to work on how we capitalise on that?
Well, I don't think it is too early to think about it, and I'll give you two examples. One of the areas that I think has absolutely been put in the spotlight in this crisis is, as I said, the crucial importance of data and data flows. And I think one of the lessons for the country as a whole is, as we think about other risks, are we clear about what the data flows are? Are we clear about what data is required to inform that, and how would we deal with that? So I think there's a different way of thinking about risk planning, which really speaks to data flows. And then I think the lessons in terms of carbon neutrality, which is clearly a critical one, is get more information out there and have a public dialogue, and make sure that people actually can be engaged. And I think in that one, there's been some good progress, but there is a very, I would say sometimes a very skewed discussion around it. So people latch onto one part of the problem, whereas of course with net zero, this is a whole systems problem, which is very, very complicated, where one bit offsets the other. Thank you.
Now, a question from Professor Colin Dayan from the British Society of Immunology. Basically wants to know if, I suppose this question goes wider as well, is the impact, will there be a lasting effect of COVID-19 on the way we conduct clinical research in the UK, in the way we distribute funds to ensure that we don't lose any or underfund any branches of scientists? Will this change the way scientific research is done in the UK?
I suspect it will in some ways, and I want to pick out some of the beneficial things that have been seen. The first is that scientists have come together in partnerships in a way that's often quite difficult. I mean, scientists like to work together, but it's often quite difficult to make that happen, to do it quickly. And here there's been an extraordinary set of examples of scientists from different disciplines coming together and working together quickly. The second example is the funding agencies have been really quite quick in getting money out of the door, and that's worked well. And I think that's a lesson about how one can think about reducing bureaucracy. And the third is that it's very clear that in order to guide us going forward, there are certain studies and certain bits of science which are absolutely essential for government decisions to be done. And that means that there are some things which just need to be funded for government's sake. And that, I think, could be a clearer process for science in some areas going forward as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Obviously, you talked about the various umpires, players, etc. in your address. One of those is the media. Do you feel that they have managed to communicate the science correctly at all times? I mean, obviously there are specialist science journalists who may well be very well placed to do that, but because this was a mainstream news story, did you feel that at times they were chasing headlines rather than actually portraying the uncertainty that exists when providing scientific advice?
Well, on the whole, I think they've tried to, and I have a session every week with the science journalists where I try and make sure that they get information they need to write their stories, and they can then help their colleagues. I mean, you know better than I do, you're never going to stop journalists wanting to chase headlines, and therefore it's undoubtedly the case that on occasions there have been quite skewed interpretations, very extreme polarized view of things that are more complicated. You know, I'm not naive enough to think you're ever going to stop that, but I think in many ways the journalists have tried pretty hard to try and understand this.
Thank you. I don't know if you would care. I mean, obviously at the moment, again, we are had some new policy advice yesterday, which covers those three areas of science, policy, and political, which is the obligation to wear a face mask in well, public places, I suppose, it's shops mainly. But is that advice that perhaps should have been given earlier, or is it now a sensible thing to do as more people are coming out of lockdown? What's the scientific view on that will inform policy and the political decision?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think our advice on this has been pretty clear for a while, which is that the role of masks is most useful in crowded places where you might not be able to keep distances, and particularly in indoor environments. And that advice remains the case and takes into account the different modes of transport, potential modes of transmission. So I think that is an important time in which you should use masks. I don't think that. Sorry, I've slightly forgotten where you start on that question. Just remind me what.
Well, it was around scientific advice on the use of masks and the fact that they are now being.
Yeah, timing. Okay. Yeah, sorry, the timing point. Sorry. Yes, absolutely. Well, of course, when we were all locked down, they were pretty irrelevant. And as you go back out into the community, and as potentially we go into a situation where numbers may increase, because that is what is expected in autumn and winter, then these sorts of measures become progressively more important. And so, yes, you know, it's going to be more crucial to do this as we go forward. But it's important that masks are just one part of it. We shouldn't forget all the other things that are important: hand washing, keeping distancing. They are crucial parts of this too, and we shouldn't just think that with masks we've got the answer, which means that we can relax the other points.
Okay, thank you. I think perhaps I'm conscious of time. One final question, which and then I might ask you to leave us with the takeaway. But the final question, which was that in other countries, particularly China, and this comes from Ken Timmis, the Society for Applied Microbiology, patients were diverted away from mainstream hospitals into shelter hospitals, which allowed the normal hospitals to continue to provide services, whereas we were diverting patients into hospitals, which effectively disrupted or halted many other normal procedures. Was there any particular reason for that we decided to do it that way, having built the Nightingale hospitals, not to use those, but to keep COVID patients inside our mainstream hospitals?
I think you're firmly into operational aspects of the NHS here, which I'm afraid I'm not able to comment on. So I can't give you any insight into that.
Fine. Okay. So there was no scientific advice on that.
Well, our advice was on actually being really critical, because we did pick up on the sort of nosocomial transmission, the inside hospital transmission, quite early, and said it's really important you get the infection control mechanisms right, including making sure you separate infected and uninfected patients with the appropriate measures.
Okay, thank you. Then just finally, this has been an extraordinary period where the focus has been very much on science. We have a public that's listening. We need to capitalise on that, as I said earlier. What do you want to be the lasting positive legacy of the virus? Has been a crisis for the country, but we'll come out of this, I hope, stronger. What would you like to be the legacy of this that we can take forward and find positive in?
Well, in the middle of it, it's quite difficult to feel super positive about any of this at the moment. It's pretty tough, but I do think that there is an absolute understanding inside government now that science is important in all sorts of areas of government, where previously you were pushing hard to get science heard. I do not think that will be the case going forward, and I think that will be to the benefit of a lot of government and the policies that come out.
Fantastic. Sir Patrick Vallance, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning and for all you have been doing to guide us through this. It must have been a very trying time, so we thank you for what you've been doing.